Back with us on the SportsMax Zone. When the United States Congress passed a bill that will allow U.S. officials to prosecute individuals involved in doping conspiracies at international sporting events, the president of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, Travis Tygart, described it as a monumental day in the fight against doping worldwide. The act has been the subject of much discussion in subsequent days, with questions being raised about its intent and potential effectiveness, its efficacy. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, through its president, Witold Banka, has raised concern about the potential for the legislation to disrupt the global legal anti-doping framework. There are also issues surrounding extraterritoriality, possible provocation of already strained relations between USADA and WADA, along with the fear of reversing global harmonization in the fight against doping. Wayne, you weren't here when we looked at this in depth earlier this week. It is intended, the law is, to penalize those who conspire with the athletes, because usually the athlete is the one who's front and center, found guilty, well, accused of doping, charged with doping, tried, found guilty, sanctioned, career in tatters, reputation damaged. Some people come from it, most people their careers never recover, and it's the athlete alone. But what about the conspirators? What about the sponsors? What about the agents? What about the coaches, the masseurs, the masseurs, everybody around in that circle who are party to the conspiracy? The U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate have decided to intervene, to put in a law to punish those people. Minimum fine, well, maximum fine of up to $1 million, maximum sentence up to 10 years in prison. What say you about it?
This is going to be difficult. Or you're going to prove that they are culpable, those other support staff. And secondly, you remember in the past when an athlete is found guilty of a doping offense, he lean it onto maybe his manager or the masseuse or somebody. No one is going to take that blame now and said, I'll deal with it up front. The interesting question I want to ask, though, George, is that what in a situation where I am an athlete and I've been found of contravening some rules within the drugs and said I'm found guilty of doping and I'm banned for 4 years, right? And while I am I'm going to go to the Court of Arbitration, CAS, to appeal my sentence. What's the Congress, what this law is about? Or are they going to treat it that the fact that I am appealing, and it might take a year, it might take 2 years. Should it take that long? What will happen then?
Well, if your question is to the athlete has recourse at CAS to appeal their punishment, where would the co-conspirators, if we can call them that, where would they appeal? Well, they'll have to take on the federal system in the United States, because it is that federal system that they're up against, which is a mighty machine at the best of times. And we all know that when the feds come with their case, it's usually a very, very tough nut to crack. And so, Mariah, Wayne raises some interesting questions, though, about how do you catch people. But I'm sure the framers of the legislation are confident in the investigative capability and the capacity of those who will enforce the law, and then of the legal system to deliver what they believe to be justice.
Definitely, and I think it's really up to those in charge of the legal system. I think Wayne asked a very difficult question, one that I don't have the answer for, Wayne, because I mean those creating the law will have to ensure that, of course, those executing and those behind the system itself do what they have to do. Where I stand when it comes to legislation, George and Wayne, I think I've said it before when we discussed this topic. I said that, you know, there are legislation in place to deal with crime. There's legislation in place to deal with drugs and all these different things. To ask that, you know, it has been eradicated completely, that's a definite no-no. But it is a step in the right direction in the sense that, you know, people will still be afraid because you can be sanctioned. You know, it can reduce the amount, but to say get rid of it completely.
Well, just before you go in, because we have Travis Tygart now, the head of USADA, I must say it's a piece of legislation that I welcome wholeheartedly. It's never perfect. There is no perfect piece of legislation anywhere in the world. And, you know, perhaps it is that the comments now can inform any amendments down the road. Travis Tygart, welcome to the program, sir. So good of you to spare some time to talk about this very important topic.
Well, thank you for having me. It is very important, and I appreciate you devoting a little bit of time to it. So thanks a lot for having me. It's great to see you, and look forward to having a conversation about it.
Excellent. So when we discussed this earlier with our track and field expert or journalist who has been steeped in covering the sport, the discussion took a certain tack we wanted to get a legal perspective. Of course, you are a lawyer by training, and given your experience at the head of USADA, you've been the leader since 2007, been a part of USADA since 2002, and you have been a part of many significant doping cases, busting doping rings and organized attempts to subvert free competition and clean competition. So you are well placed to talk to us. I wanted to start, Travis, at the perspective of defining what does international sporting events mean? What does that umbrella nomenclature capture? What are the events captured under the definition international sporting events as written in the legislation?
Yeah, well, thanks for your kind words, and don't hold it against me that I am a lawyer by training. But listen, the legislation is crystal clear that number one, the WADA code has to apply to the event for the law to apply. Number two, the event or the organizer of the event has to receive money from the U.S. federal government or a company from the U.S. to sponsor the event or the organizer or to broadcast it. And then number three, there has to be at least one U.S. athlete and 3 or more foreign athletes competing in that event. And that's the only context legally under which this law would apply. And obviously what it's trying to do is to capture and hold accountable those people in sport and government who may be outside of the WADA code jurisdiction, who are defrauding the event and the money that U.S. government or U.S. companies are paying for the event by doping athletes to participate in that event. So the law expressly excludes athletes from criminal liability. The WADA code will deal with that. This is for those folks who typically are outside of the WADA code jurisdiction, who perpetuate doping fraud by, conspiring sometimes with athletes, sometimes with their coaches, their trainers, doctors, to then dope athletes. It is really aimed to fill the gap to hold those folks accountable.
There are fears about a muddling of the global anti-doping picture by this piece of legislation, and the fear that other nations will enact legislation similar to what the US has done. Is that a real fear or just the understandable reaction of those who are in opposition to this piece of legislation right now?
I don't know why we would be fearful of every country who invests significant amounts of its own money into events outside of its territories passing laws that protect that money, that investment from people defrauding it. And the very ways that the sport rules apply to that event, those who intentionally cheat that event, defraud that event. Think about it. The investment that NBC makes into the Sochi Winter Olympic Games in 2014, their $8 billion or whatever the ultimate number was significantly less because we've now, because of state-sponsored doping in Russia, have had to go back and undo so many victories and rearrange gold medals. Russia is no longer the medal winner. So the money that NBC invested into that event has been degraded because of the cheating in violation of the rules, the WADA code, that Russia, many co-conspirators did to violate it. So every country ought to pass a similar law to protect their investment, whether it's on their home soil or across the pond or wherever it may be internationally, to protect their financial investment in those events so that their money is not defrauded.
I want to draw your attention to a quote from the head of WADA. I'm going to put that up on the screen in short order. Mr. Banker, specifically what he's saying about the difficulty that he has with the legislation and how it may create an imbalance in the realm of enabling legislation dealing with these things. But beyond that, there's also the issue, Travis, of persons saying that, look, let's take the quote now before we move on. This is what Mr. Banker said. It is likely, he says, to lead to overlapping laws in different jurisdictions that will compromise having a single set of anti-doping rules for all sports and all anti-doping organizations under the WADA code. I see you shaking your head. You disagree?
It's not informed or it's misinformed, hopefully not intentional, that frequently there are people that are not subject to anti-doping rules. The WADA code does not apply to a doctor who has no accreditation to the event or any affiliation with a sports federation. That's Victor Conti from Balco, right? They're outside of sports jurisdiction. And so the WADA rules don't apply to them. This law, if that person dopes an athlete at an event covered by the anti-doping rules, WADA's rules, and U.S. money is involved, they then will be covered by the law. So there is no outright duplication or any confusion. And listen, if there are folks who do it who are also covered by the anti-doping rules, that likelihood happens all the time. And all it means is you have to cooperate and coordinate to have the best outcome and ensure that justice is served. The athletes will be bound by the WADA code, and they're expressly exempt from this legislation. It's the folks who aren't covered by the WADA code who are clearly aimed in the targets of this legislation. So that combination is a wonderful, win-win situation to hold really the baddest actors of the doping scheme, which are those who conspire to abuse athletes to a certain extent and cause athletes to dope. The athletes will be held accountable by the WADA code.
Yes.
The folks that are outside the WADA code who need to be held accountable.
Travis, we have various people watching this interview who come from a various information base. It's different. So I want to ask this question and get an answer that can bring everybody up to speed. I want to use a practical example to elucidate what we're talking about. Let's go back to Floyd Landis, Tyler Hamilton, and Lance Armstrong, and doping in cycling. We all know, we've seen reams of paper with Floyd Landis' name in it. Tyler Hamilton, what he said about what he saw, what he did, and what, of course, they say Lance Armstrong did, which, of course, we know how that turned out. So are you saying then that in a case where Floyd falls, Tyler Hamilton falls, Lance Armstrong is knocked down several pegs from being a hero and an inspiration to being exposed for what he was, a fraud? You're saying that the unnamed actors, the non-athletes, the non-accredited people who helped them and who used U.S. money or used the U.S. banking system, are you saying that the legislation is intended to punish those so they don't go after new Floyd Landises, new Tyler Hamilton, and new Lance Armstrong? Is that what this legislation is designed to do?
You absolutely got it. It's the team owners, it's anybody in the sport that conspired to dope or knew that those athletes were doping. Those athletes would be treated the same. Lance would have gotten his lifetime ban. But the doctors who are outside of jurisdiction sometimes, any coaches that are outside of jurisdiction, team owners, sport administrators, they would be then held accountable, which sport just frequently doesn't have the jurisdiction to do. The other more recent example would be the president of the International Track and Field Athletics Association, Lemay Diak. When he took bribes, as has now been demonstrated by the court in France, to cover up Russian doping cases, he conspired to allow dope athletes to compete in major competitions. He would then be held accountable under this rule.
Travis, do you have any fear of the threat of global harmonization in the fight against doping in sport?
I think this. I honestly believe this will, and we've talked to law enforcement around the world, as well as other NATOs around the world, and what we hear, and of course we don't want it to upset the anti-doping system that WADA rules apply to and the code is in place for. That's not what this would do at all, and we wouldn't support that. We think the opposite will happen. We think it's going to force and incentivize coordination, and what we hear from law enforcement is they're really excited about it. Just like the Swiss National Police helped the FBI and the Department of Justice in the FIFA case, where they were able to show the corruption at FIFA, the bribery and the corruption of the bank and wire fraud acts, that most people thought that was a wonderful case. It was based on U.S. law because U.S. money and the banking system was utilized, but most of the activity happened off of U.S. territory. But the Swiss National Police were engaged and coordinating closely with the FBI and the Department of Justice, and they brought justice to those who robbed, millions of dollars and put it in the pockets of sport officials and not where it should go, which is developing countries as well as athletes who participate in the sport of soccer around the world. And you have to remember, WADA, but really the IOC, had the opportunity to change the rules of the WADA code to ensure that these types of people that fall outside of the WADA code would be covered by the WADA code. And for 2 years during the WADA code consultation process, which ended in 2019, in November of 2019, for 2 years prior to that, there was a rule that did cover sport officials and others who dope these types of events. But at the last minute in a closed door meeting in Tokyo in September of 2019, the IOC got that rule removed so that these sport officials, Thomas Ion from weightlifting, Diak from track and field, Yuri Nagornik, who oversaw the Russia state-sponsored doping, who was a member of the Russian NOC, National Olympic Committee, clearly perpetuated doping fraud. They are excluded from accountability under the WADA code. That was an intentional decision by the IOC, and I think it reveals that they just simply don't want to have to be accountable to the laws that our athletes, or rules that our athletes are held accountable to, or the ones that many of us in our own countries are held accountable.
Okay, Travis, I need to ask you this. Okay, let me make a statement first. Yeah, Pakistani cricketer representing Pakistan was in England, representing Pakistan, playing against England. He was convicted of match fixing, and he was sent to prison. In the Indian Premier League now in India, players have been arrested and taken in front of the courts with looking at long, punishment in prison and so on. Many persons are of the view, including lawyers, that these infringements by these athletes are not criminal by nature, and therefore there are other ways you can treat it. You can fine them, you can suspend them, you can ban them for life. Why is it that the Congress has decided to make this a felony, really, where someone can actually go to prison for something that they can be banned for life?
Listen, I agree with you, and this law agrees with you as well. The athletes are expressly exempt. It says this does not apply to athletes. This is only those who are perpetuating fraud by seeking money and investment into events, promising that the rules will be played by a certain way, and then knowingly going behind and violating that agreement and causing athletes and conspiring with athletes to dope. It's those people that are held accountable. And many people think that it is a crime. When you take someone else's money and you promise to use it in a way that is by the rules of the event,
yes,
and then it's done in a different way,
yes,
that's fraud.
Yeah.
Now, there is fraud, there is criminal fraud, but at the end of the day, this is a criminal fraud statute that, look, hopefully those who are going to act bad clean themselves up, yes, before this comes into place, and it never is used.
Absolutely so. Absolutely
wonderful
so.
Outcome.
Travis Tygart, thank you very much for speaking with us. We will continue to look at this piece of legislation, and may the force be with you and those who continue to wage the fight against doping.
Thanks, my friend. Thanks for having me. Great
Excellent.
to talk to you.
Good. That's the head of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, Travis Tygart, talking about the issue of doping and a law in the USA. Wayne, it's an excellent point you raised, but as he rightly said, and the legislation says, it's not the athlete, it's those, because again, unknown Joe, we could be conspirators. We're not athletes anymore. You're not an athlete anymore. We were never athlete quality, really. So we could conspire to have the athletes, the champs stars, the football stars, table tennis stars, right, who are going to represent Jamaica, representing TNT, representing Barbados, doping, and we just replace them when they get caught. We move on to the next victim. It's intended to punish us. So the cycle, the chain link, the network that we have trying to corrupt these individuals, that link is broken. And I think from that perspective, it's a welcome addition.
It's like the drug lords.
Absolutely, to the legislative landscape. Very good example to use. We take a break. We come right back with more.